So welcome everyone. It's October the 7th, 2020. Don Prezant here with many of the usual suspects, including my colleague Serge Ravet. Happy to present to you a very interesting report that came out recently from the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. And it basically calling for a paradigm shift in education, trying to make things more holistic, more social, more, I guess, accessible and systemic, but I don't want to take too many words out of the mouth of our presenter. Very happy to present Danielle Baril today. Danielle is Executive Director of the Institute for Cooperation in Adult Education in French, that is ICEA, I-C-E-A. And he sits on several bodies of adult education organizations in Quebec and other places, including internationally, including he's the president of the board of directors for the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, and very much led the charge for this report that's being presented today. So very honored to have Danielle with us today, and looking forward to what he has to say.
Thank you, Don. Is the sound good just before I jump in? Okay,
very
perfect.
Good.
Thank you. Really thank you for inviting me and giving me the occasion to share what I consider as an important report from the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning that I'll call UIL to make it shorter for next. What I would want to do in this presentation is to share with you highlights of that report, knowing the Badges community. Some of the principles expressed in this report will be familiar to you, more particularly a wider vision of adult and learning and education, and the diversity of learning sites and knowledges and competencies developed, and also the diversity of assessment and recognition tool. Principles that are at the basis of the Badges movement. I have different hats in that presentation as chair of the board of UIL, but also as a member of the expert group that UIL put together to feed them on a new vision for lifelong learning. What I will do in the presentation, just to give you a quick context of the report, to locate the report and the formal processes that gave birth to it, to highlight some anchor points of the vision that was proposed in the report, a wider vision of adult education and learning, and more globally lifelong learning, and overview of the action points. What I liked in the process is UIL asked us to share, to construct the vision, but brought us to translate that vision in action point, in formal propositions that were proposed in the report. In terms of the context, every 20+ year, UNESCO published a vision document about education. There's been one in the 70s and the 90s, and last autumn, UNESCO launched a formal process of producing a new report. So there is an international commission set up within UNESCO to produce that report on the futures of education, and the plural there is important in a perspective of scenario construction. UNESCO is opening up the debate in the field for many different scenarios regarding the future, and the horizon is 2050. So in 2050, what could be the outlook of education and learning in a lifelong perspective, and what do we have to do from now till then to construct that vision? So there is a formal process within UNESCO that's calling for input from different body of UNESCO, but also researchers, and there's been an online consultation for every human being on Earth to be able to feed the Commission on the futures of education. Within the ecosystem of UNESCO, there is one institute that has lifelong learning as specific as a mission, as a specific mission. It is the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, UIL. Naturally, UIL wanted to make a contribution to a UNESCO reflection, so they set up an expert group that worked and designed a vision that became the official contribution of UIL to the UNESCO Commission. It's important to specify the audience of the report. It is the UNESCO's Commission on the Future of Lifelong Education, and member states, so government, and the wider community of people involved in learning, being youth-oriented or adult learning. So that expert group worked in May and June, and the report, Embracing a Culture of Lifelong Learning, was published early September. That's for the formal institutional context of the report. The reflection of the working group that was translated in the report anchors itself on some fundamental principles and fact. The most important of it is, even if lifelong learning is within the educational debate for decades since the early 60s, it's still a vision to be implemented. We still have a youth and school-based vision of government, to be more precise, still have a youth-oriented and school-based understanding of education, and within the urgency and action plan put up during the COVID-19, we've seen that really strongly. And that vision of lifelong learning still has the challenges to be implemented beyond being conceptually clear for the people involved in designing it. The role of learning in a lifelong learning perspective is transversal to basically every crisis that we have and challenges that humanity is facing, being climate crisis, technological development, and more, and even populism within the political debate. So there is a necessity for a wider vision. And lifelong learning has a lot to contribute to develop the capacity of citizens in every spheres of their life. But in the policy debate, there is a tension within government between a limitative approach focused mainly on job-related issue, and right now in the follow-up of the health crisis, the upskilling and reskilling challenges that a lot of government are dealing with might strengthen that shrinking of the debate on learning towards a job-related training, and growing needs in many spheres of society, from health issue, digital skills, citizenship skills, financial literacy skills, etc., etc. There's a wider growing needs for adults to be competent in basically every spheres of their life. The report also anchors itself in an outlook. It is a typical UNESCO perspective, but some aspect of that outlook was important in our debate and shaped the conclusion. The humanistic vision is a given for UNESCO, a human right-based approach through the understanding of education and learning. The creation of a lifelong learning society, the goal is not education as an end in itself, but it's education as instrumental in creating a dynamic and knowledgeable and learning society. So that was the perspective. We talked a lot and debated a lot about that individual and collective dimension. At the end, both of it seemed essential to a more complex and nuanced vision of and understanding of education. An individual dimension based on a learner-centered and learner-demand approach, answering the specific learning needs and learning styles of learners, but also a collective dimension. And two aspects to me were interesting in that collective dimension within the report. To say that we do learn from each other, there's peer-to-peer and intergenerational learning. We need skills to interact with other interpersonal skills, and we need to learn to develop some capacity for our collective, common, and more global good, because the climate crisis, the racism, and a lot of our, as humanity, we deal with issues that need from each of us specific capacity development. So the collective dimension was really framed out as we learn from each other, we learn to interact with each other, and we have to learn collectively to go beyond issues that we do have as humanity. The systemic vision, I'll come back to it, was important to go beyond a school-based, youth-based understanding of education. And we kind of pushed forward our thinking, what could be a vision in 2050. Essentially, what it was is we would be in a learning society. Learning would be ingrained and reflects in every sphere of our life, and we would mobilize every aspect, every modality, every pedagogy, every learning site for any learning content. And that would be a given, ingrained in our daily life. And education would be an understanding where we go to school and we registered and we go in a time slot to learn pre-formatted teaching and learning and programs. So that essentially that was the vision, and we worked backwards 2050 from now, and what should be put into motion right now to create that vision. There is 10 action points within the report. I won't go into all the details, just to share with you the spirit of each of them. The holistic vision of lifelong learning was front and center. It is any human being, from infant to youth to child to adult, all the way through life. And it is also every learning site, being formal or autonomous learning, online learning, experiential learning. We have to take into account every dimension of learning, and that might be a given for a lot of us, but from a government perspective, that's still an understanding to shape out. And the challenges we had is, how do we operationalize such a holistic character of vision, understanding of lifelong learning? The fact that the learning issues are front and center and part of basically every challenges that humanity is facing is asking us to adopt and integrate the transdisciplinary research and intersectorial way of putting people together. Researchers, advocate, educators, different ministries, etc., etc. We cannot only work from an education ministry perspective. It is a governmental, it is a societal, it is intersectorial, and from a researcher point of view, we need transdisciplinary research to understand the interrelatedness and the complexity of the way different kind of learning, different way to learn can answer and contribute to solve fundamental challenges that humanity is facing. So that was it is a big part of the report also. Necessarily, all of us are not equal. Many of us are autonomous learner. We're comfortable using and benefiting from any tool, especially digital tools that we can access to get knowledge, to get the knowledge we need and to learn. But there is among developed country, maybe 20% of the population, and overall worldwide, when we take stock that there's like 20 to 25 countries where more than 50% of the population are basically illiterate. They have problem reading a basic sentence linked to daily life chore. We need to focus and make sure that that lifelong learning society and all the resources and the potentiality we do have now to learn doesn't increase the divide between the haves and the haves not, but are put at the service of a more egalitarian, in the name of equality and social justice. So from a UNESCO perspective, that's a given also that we work with and try to translate within the report, or how especially digital potential and tools can answer a more vulnerable good. The common good was part of the debate, and it's interesting how members of the expert group were knowledgeable about the common perspective, and it got integrated as a more collective governance, not only in terms of the democratic participation of people to the governance of education, but also all those co-design, co-creation, commons perspective that are probably known to a lot of you and are part of some part of the badges community. So it is integrated in the report as a mean to co-design and have a more democratic understanding of lifelong learning as common good. And the backdrop is not a market oriented and everybody by themselves within the jungle of if you can profit from it, if you cannot, deal with it. The technology dimension was necessarily front and center, especially within, we were at the early months of the health crisis in May and June. So we talked a lot, exchanged a lot. In the report, what I find interesting is to mobilize every tool, every technology, every digital tool that we can to make sure that we have a more equitable access to learning technology and learning overall. We even integrated within the report from badges to micro certification, online micro certification to learning management system, how we can mobilize every tools and means and that technology offers us for the greater good and answering everybody learning need, especially marginalized and more vulnerable groups. And it phrased out within a specific proposition that we have, that UNESCO create a specific initiative to put learning technology for the common and the public good from here to 2050. So there is the proposition in the report to create a momentum and a specific initiative to use technology for public and common good. More particularly, all the public institution, formal school-based institution from high school to university have to redesign themselves to go beyond offering MOOC. They have to be a part of a creation of an environment, an ecosystem of learning, and transform their curriculum, their pedagogy, and overall transform completely themselves. And so that was a part of the report to call for that transformation from formal schooling. The collective dimension of learning was an important part. I highlighted it earlier. So there's proposition to really not only to sustain, recognize, and put into the mainstream debate of the education and policymaking, peer-to-peer learning, learning from others, community, collective, intergenerational learning, but also public spaces. There is within UNESCO a global network of learning cities that have hundreds of members and is very dynamic and plays a leadership role within UNESCO and UIL. So cities, municipalities, mayor, local government have to be brought within a management of a collective dimension of learning. And in that perspective, local initiative, not only government, state-based, the big machinery of education program, but really construct bottom-up an understanding of lifelong learning and support local, individual-based initiative of learning, peer-to-peer learning, etc., etc. Workplace learning is important around the world, and we see now a kind of an immense pressure on workplace learning to widen the learning package they're offering, including health-related issue and reskilling and upskilling at the level of government and policies. And that workplace learning has to be understood as a major way to, as a major tools and perspective for justice, educational justice, and bringing people through learning to specific skills for a job, to get a job, such a job, and get out of poverty for the ones who are put in that situation. Last action points that proposed, it's the international right to education. The right to education is within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1946. There is a need to actualize and modernize the right to education and transform it in a lifelong learning as a right to a human right to lifelong learning. And within the report, there's perspective proposed, and including framing up what could be the legal framework for lifelong learning in a knowledge society, with all the tools that we have, with all the diversity of learning sites and strategy, pedagogical strategy, from on face-to-face, online, blended learning that we can have. And just more specifically about the digital technology and micro certification, just to highlight as a conclusion items that are there. The we talked a lot through a discussion about learning management system potentiality, that digital technology should be mastered and used to manage learning pathways and learning ecosystem. And that's how conceptually we attack the complexity of learning in the 21st century. Is we have to go beyond episode of learning. We have to have a systemic understanding of learning pathways, the multiplicity and the accumulation of learning episodes within one's life, and an learning ecosystem. And in that regard, the digital technology from badges to learning management system has a role to play. And the understanding we had in leveraging digital platform stems from that role, that new, more innovative tool that digital platform can play. The challenges is most of those tools are private based and market oriented. So that stresses the need for a public common good perspective in developing co-constructive digital tools and mobilizing them to organize learning pathways and manage a learning ecosystem. That's why the discussion with the private sector of the digital economy is part of the report. And finally, all of those reflections were integrated and systematized in the report towards in the form of a call of a new UNESCO initiative that would be towards 250 digital learning technology for the common and the public good. That would be all for a global presentation of the report, and I would prefer now if we can exchange, ask questions, and I will use questions to deepen aspect of the report. Right now, that document is officially, we will present it in 2 weeks' time to the UNESCO International Commission, so it would be within the official reflection. And like what we're doing now, UIL is trying to multiply the occasion to present the report, and through the report have a discussion about that paradigm shift that we need to do. I think most of us are probably there conceptually and their practices, but as probably a lot of you know, governments have a few steps to make to reach that wider perspective. Don?
Great, thanks very much, Danielle. As usual, my fingers are a little sprained from trying to keep up. What I'm going to do actually is, if I may, share that sort of key points, key messages and action points page, and maybe that can help us focus our remarks. We have a number of questions here. Let me just see. Serge, why don't you start with yours, and then I'll just sort of get back here.
Yes, my question is about a possible blind spot in UNESCO in relation to learning. The saying that someone with a hammer to someone with hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so there is this idea, okay, we want people to learn, we need to provide more learning, but at the same time, we don't recognize what people already know. So we define people by the fact that they don't know things. So we are in a deficit model. And I think UNESCO is not totally innocent from this deficit model, because it's always, we need to provide more learning. But if we take an issue like, you mentioned racism, for example, the problem of racism is not fundamentally a problem of learning, it's a problem of recognition. Mm. And in the field of education, we tend to look at recognition as something that comes at the end. You learn, then you get a diploma, a certificate. But in reality, the recognition is at the beginning. The most important recognition, which is to recognize a person as a human being, starts at the beginning. And a lot of the problems we have, if we take school dropouts, for example, In France, there was a book written by Filouzi and et al. About apartheid scolaire. The fact that there are schools where there is really racial segregation in France. He studied the Academy of Bordeaux. It's not a problem of education. It's fundamentally a problem of recognition. And I don't see this issue of recognition being addressed full blast by UNESCO. Maybe I'm missing something, but for me, it is the fundamental problem that we're facing today. If we say in France, for example, the Gilets jaunes, that was a problem of recognition, and they put a yellow vest to be visible. And I think there is this invisibility a problem which is absolutely critical. And invisibility is not addressed by more education. I don't say that you don't need any education at all, but it is something which can't be corrected just. And so this notion of visibility, of invisibility, which is one of the great problems we have in our society. If we take migrants, refugees, Black or brown people in America, this is not a problem of education, this is a problem of recognition. Fundamentally, education can help, but creating the conditions for recognition and addressing it as a recognition problem and not an education problem, or education. Okay, I may be too long, sorry, but it's just to say, I'm frustrated with UNESCO where I don't see this issue being addressed fully.
Overall, I would agree. The center of gravity is towards the social demand for learnings. And when UNESCO argues and UIL argues that with the many crises we have, we need to develop capacity building, so social demand for learning, to answer those needs. And I did mention that the slogan, the thematic of the International Commission is learning to become. So it is a social demand. We face crisis, we need to become, we have to go beyond learning to learn. So I agree that the center of gravity is toward a deficit model and not a recognition. There is a track within UNESCO of guidelines on validation, recognition of learning that encompass more the vision of, but the center of gravity of the debate is the learning demand. I agree with you. I wouldn't argue against. I agree with you that there's a stress within international community about the crisis we're facing, and we have to transform ourselves. But I totally agree that the premises is not we are, and we should recognize what we have, and badges and all that technology and comes after recognizing what people know. But we do see that within First Nations or Indigenous international declaration recognizing the traditional knowledges of such a culture, and so there's parts of the UNESCO system where the vision is toward recognizing, but the more mainstream debate about education is answering a social, expressing and answering a social demand. I agree.
Yeah, even when you say learning to become, you are already.
Yeah, I agree. Totally.
So, Serge, I'm going to skip over.
Sure, yes.
You and maybe the next, actually a lot of these questions have a commonality. So I have a loaded question. Do you see issues in the higher education approach to micro-credentials for lifelong learning? And what's packed in that is the fact that 80 to 90% of micro-credentialing in higher education is take a course, get a badge, and then maybe stack up those badges in a preconceived framework of stackability. Rather than taking what a person knows, adapting it to the context and learning from the person and helping the person develop from there. So recognition of prior learning is what brought me, so you'll see there's another question about RVA further down. Recognition of prior learning is what brought me to open badges. And I guess what I'm talking about here is this, what I see as a growing divide between micro-credentials as they've been redefined by higher education and the original idea, which was more the idea of alternative credential and recognizing what the person has done, recognition of achievement, and I keep on forgetting that phrase where you basically recognize what that person has done as a starting point for taking them forward.
I agree with that vision. I mean, as the organization I work for operate a badge system, we're an NGO, and it's a generic skills framework that we use for marginalized people. So to me, my understanding is it's like a paradigm shift when you read Kuhn is you have problems that the actual model cannot answer, and there's new answers to that problem, the anomaly. Badges are a new answer to a problem is that school-based assessment is limited. It does what it does, but it's limited. So to me, when I see some universities here, for example, what I know from Canada, that actually are transforming badges as an equivalent or of a diploma, to me, they're denaturing, I don't know if I get that word right, denaturing the spirit and the reason why badges exist. It's to create an alternative system to be able to accreditate and formalize experiential learning and non-school based learning. So my view is they're emitting badges, but essentially it's just an electronic paper that they could do through a diploma or short programs or modules or so the day that university will redefine themselves and be part of within a global ecosystem of learning and recognize widely what people can do, because they have an advantage, the specialists of assessment. So that's the advantages they have. They're really specialists of assessment. So that they should put that at the forefront and not specialists of teaching and their program. But right now, to me, badges are an alternative answer to recognize learning done outside of school. And it's more bridges with from badges system to formal schooling that should be explored. So I agree that there's a bit of a denaturing of the DNA of the tool and the political and educational context that gave birth to it.
Okay. So that's a great segue to Tanis's question, and I'm going to focus on the second half of the question, which is, what does it require for higher education to take more of a recognition approach? What do they need to operationalize, and what are some paths they could take?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim to be a specialist of higher education, but my view is they have to shift from managing the inventory of courses and programs that they have in a pre-formatted and offering it. University of the 21st, maybe the 22nd century, would be a learning management system and manage learning pathways and be an actor within an ecosystem of learning. So the Taylor industrial pipeline of taking courses and programs is a 20th century model. They're slowly reshaping themselves towards, and I'm not talking about being an online university that just offer the inventories management system of offering classes online. It's just changing the distribution system from face-to-face to online. Is they have to become a learning management system for the social and the common good. That would be my view, and it's a bit what I'm promoting here in Quebec and Canada when I have the chance to exchange with different actors from the field of work or education. We have to manage an ecosystem of learning now and situate ourselves within it. And people have learning pathways. They don't have episode of learning. They're constructing themselves. And I should not forget and integrate now that they already know something and they're already starting from somewhere. They're not only in deficit of learning, they actually have assets as learners and capacity. So Serge, I will not forget that part, that dimension from now on.
Great. So does that help, Tanis? Do you have any follow-ups there?
Yeah, no, I mean, this whole conversation has been really helpful. I'm still stuck on prior learning and assessment and recognition, which is what we call it here in BC. Because what I see is real capacity issues in institutions. I mean, I'm learning, it's not across the board. I mean, there are colleges and universities that don't have capacity to do that well, yet we are, getting really, really excited about micro-credentials. And to the point earlier about, maybe microcreds really starts with the RPL process versus the reverse. And I guess I have so many questions about this alternate system that we're creating and how it potentially further marginalizes if this equity sort of system that we have, which I think is PLAR. I mean, I do believe that, I'm not an expert in PLAR, but conceptually it makes sense. But if there isn't the capacity or the ability to operationalize that, then you just have another alternate system that further marginalizes. So, I mean, that's really the piece I'm really stuck on right now. And, I'll just leave it there and just say that this has probably been the deepest conversation I've heard about micro-credentials in relation to lifelong learning. So I really appreciate the critical thinking that's happening here about that.
Just a comment from me. I did a report for eCampus Ontario and interviewed a number of people getting involved in this and had a really interesting PLAR type conversation with Otago Polytech. So they're actually presenting at EPIC, and they went into it really sort of pushing the RPL part, and actually it didn't fly as well as they expected right off the hop, because people wanted what they said was the full meal deal. Let me take the course or whatever, and then I guess maybe they build confidence with it. So it's just worthwhile thinking that through, because people need, what's the word, on-ramps to get into that RPL thing, because RPL has been tough in the past, especially the way it's been done in post-secondary, because it's often seen as like a charity thing rather than what could be potentially a business opportunity or a way of demonstrating common good.
And just not to stress too much, my understanding is we are within a paradigm shift. We are in years and decades of transformation. So people are not all moving at the same speed. But when you know that what exists right now, a virtual tutor, AI-based virtual tutor could accredit you through an app on a phone in a fraction of a second. So when such a thing exists, we need a more global discussion. There's institutional based. From a UNESCO perspective, it's more to how do we mainstream within the education policy debate and get a point of view and involvement for a common and public good, because there's a private market existing right now. So that we get that archipelago of different sides of thinking, developing badges. But to me, the more overall environment is a paradigm shift, and we are in the midst of it. So we're not moving at the same speed.
That's certainly true.
Don, you mentioned Otago, and I think maybe I've overinterpreted what they said, but there was something a bit in line with the idea of RPL until now has been Mohammed going to the mountain, okay? So you go and you get to be accredited, but how about the mountain going to Mohammed? That is really that the university learns, and so goes to a company and create a program to recognize and learn. So the recognition process, the RPL, is not just we align against an existing pre-existing framework, but we go to your company and we recognize your practices. We create the framework that will be your reference. And so it is a learning exercise for the organization and not just an assessment exercise. Or it should be assessment in the sense of giving value to. In French, we have évaluer. Évaluer in French is donner de la valeur à. Which is often misinterpreted as some kind of judgment. And I think this idea of reversing the RPL logic, which is it is the university, the accrediting body that goes to the company and help the company and recognize the company, recognize the practices which are in the company and learn from that.
I think that's a great point to make, and that to some extent is some of the thinking that underlines this open skills network that we were talking about earlier is there are practices out there, there are skills out there that are emerging, and we need to discover them. So the example you give, I remember an article, I think David Porter was one of the authors, and the president of KPU was another one, talking about a sector in Scotland that worked with Open University Scotland, and it was about renewable energy. And it was this loop where it was knowledge discovery out in the, out in industry that was feeding knowledge building back in the thing. So there was a synergy that was building up. And so there's been some talk about applying this to typical applied research that a polytechnic might do, working with an employer, where the employees could be recognized as they're delivering information into the academy. It's can be very exciting.
And also what you can do collective recognition. It's not the individual which is recognized for a series of discrete skills, but it is the whole organization, the whole district, which is recognized for its competency as a whole. And so, and then you're not just recognized as an individual, you're recognized as an individual contributing to a community, which is much more powerful than just being recognized against a pre-existing framework.
And that's a great segue to your second question, which is the difference between educating an educating city versus a learning city.
Yeah, it's I don't think the expression educating city does exist within the discussion on learning cities. Learning cities have, I would say, like in summarizing, two different center of gravity. First, how do mayors and municipal government or actor coordinating all the educational and learning resources of their city, being school, but also community center, libraries and parks and etc. The learning city dimension, the other dimension, is how a city learns from what citizens are experiencing. Let's say, like let's talk about the US. We all have in common that reference point. Is with it through that tension, civil tension, it does play out. So it is a reality of people. How can a city and a community and a nation, and we all even see learning planet, how do we learn as more reflexively from what we're doing? So the real spirit of a learning city would be to transform the experiential what's happening within the city as a learning to better itself. And the first center of gravity is more the technical, policy oriented and coordination of infrastructures. But it's the second dimension that, to me, that characterize a learning city as like a learning organization or a learning family or whatever, is do we learn from our experiences to progress? Do we transform mistakes and pitfalls and challenges into learning occasion? That's where the real spirit of it is. And through COVID, UIL organized weekly webinar with learning cities. And the first webinar in March was with the mayor of Wuhan, where supposedly, allegedly, the virus started. So it was really interesting to hear the mayor talk in March about his experiences and what they've done, what the city had done. And every week there've been like 30 plus webinar with 4 members of the Learning City Network talking about. And I thought it was one of the most interesting and deepest reflection of education made by non-educational actors, mayors and representative of cities. So the real thing is, as an individual, how do we learn from what we experience? That's the reflexivity of a learning city. The technical part is just it's management of institution and infrastructure and creating occasion and programs. So,
do you have any documentation about what you just mentioned? Some article or recordings you could use?
If you go on the Global Learning Network, if you type Google or whatever, Quantit, the Global Learning, the Global Learning City Network, UNESCO, you'll see all the video of the webinars and documentation and etc.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much, Daniel. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So we're coming to the top of the hour. Danielle, maybe we can conclude by just asking you what would be next steps here? What do you hope will happen to this report, for example, within UNESCO, within the futures of education?
What I want to underline is this report is mainstreaming within UNESCO and UIL topic like badges and etc. that weren't part of it. So that's the important. That was what I wanted from this report, to mainstream development that I've seen outside of the traditional field of educational policy. So that's a major asset, and within UIL, further development will be made. Within the UNESCO infrastructure, in 2 weeks' time, we're presenting that report. Our challenges would be to make sure that the report, Learning to Become, the next report, the next vision paper document from UNESCO, would have that wider understanding of learning and education, recognizing everybody within it, but adding that systemic, not only youth-oriented, not only school-based. There's a lot of things that are given for a lot of us who are within that wider understanding and practices of learning and recognition and all that. You should not think it is obvious for governments and policymaking. And the part that I play within that, being in the two worlds, it's to bridge it and make sure that initiative understanding is within the policy debate. I would stop that, because just doing that is an issue and a challenge without going into the detail of different mechanisms. Just succeeding in having a wider understanding of learning and education within the mainstream policy debate, and most of it mobilizing government into international commitment, is quite a challenge. I've followed what UNESCO has done and within the COVID, and their reflexes, the international community reflexes, is you have to make sure youth, primary school is back on track online within the health pandemic, and everything else was not even discussed, not even literacy for adult. To me, I would be humble and just make sure that on the agenda, the topic of a wider vision is still discussed. Would be quite an achievement, if I may be honest with you there. From a political standpoint, of course, in our different milieu, there's more freedom to push for those issues, but having government to get there is quite a challenge.
Okay, maybe something trivial. Maybe the ORA can give you, can craft a badge for you that you could offer at your presentation in 2 weeks that people can earn.
Yeah.
Well,
I would be, I know we're at the top of the hour, but that would be my next question that I would want to hear more about, is what can little groups like ORA do to advocate and try to, bring about that paradigm shifts that you just talked about?
I think I would put my UIL at, from the global worldwide perspective on learning, it's two bridges. So every time there's an international conference of UNESCO, so to make sure that the panelists come from a wider perspective and can mainstream through their own presentation. But I would say within UNESCO, there's a field where that wider vision is there. It's all the artificial intelligence and education, mainly under the leadership of Asian country. When you look at a UNESCO conference on artificial intelligence and education, and you get into the paper, the presentation, it's not the traditional actors of the educational world that are there. It's probably some of us or the same profile. So there, what I'm doing within UIL and UNESCO, it's to bridge, to refer to other initiatives and bring them within the mainstream. So it would be to be on the lookout for UNESCO open process and to feed into them, and for people like me to invite people within those processes. In 2 years' time, in 2022, there's the next international conference of UNESCO on lifelong adult education and learning, and I'm pushing a lot for the agenda to have at least a segment on the new perspective, the new world of learning, the 21st century agenda of learning, and not only the 20th century agenda of learning. And to me, that document right now was the preamble of that work. Now there's an official document that I can lean on and people can lean on to introduce themselves and their work within UNESCO. But you always have to take into mind members of UNESCO are member state. It's not civil society or educators, it's government. So the interaction is with government, with all the patience that it needs and the long road of adult learning recognition within educational policies.
Great. So this has been a great way to kick off a conversation that we hope to pick up at EPIC, October 26th through 28th. Danielle will be presenting again in English, presenting likely in French, and hopefully also participating in a panel talking about these broader issues and hopefully bridging out to other initiatives to, as you say, mainstream these issues and make them get us away from an over focus on youth and K to 20. So that's great. Thank you very much, Danielle. This really
Welcome.
accomplished even more than I was hoping. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to all that watched us.
Yeah, there will be a recording, and that actually ends up even being an even.